Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm happy to welcome you to the second session of our summer series on stories and storytelling. And if it's your first time joining us today, then an extra special welcome to you. We don't have a sponsor for today's session, but what we do have is a lot of gratitude for just the tremendous generosity that has come in around these webinar series over the last 2 years. And we thought that today, as we are just a few years away from the end of our fiscal year here at JTS, that it would be the perfect time to collectively thank the sponsors of our sessions. It's really true that that your generosity is what's enabling us to continue with this series. So we're just tremendously grateful. Hopefully you saw the slide with all the names of the sponsors before I began, and we will put it up again at the end. And Tani, actually, maybe do you want to put it up for a second now while I'm talking about them? So we really want to thank all of the sponsors and encourage everyone else whose means allow to consider sponsoring a session going forward. I also really want to recognize everyone else who has made gifts. The generosity has not been limited to the sponsors. Many of you have made generous gifts, $360, $180, and again, the range of what your means allow. And we're so grateful, and with so many people interested in our Monday learning, which has been just tremendously gratifying and meaningful for us here at JTS. All of those gifts really add up, and you're making it possible. So thank you so much. And thanks, Tani. And now let's turn to today. So I think actually, yeah, I think that was my whole spiel. So Tani, I'm going to turn it over to you to do the rest of the announcements.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Just to review the format for today's session, Dr. Kraemer will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We'll also have some time for questions at the end of the session. You can use your chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julie Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Kraemer. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or with Ellie Gettinger, who has joined us as JTS staff on today's session. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link for the session this morning. We'll be screen sharing them as well. So pleased to introduce Dr. David Kraemer, the Joseph J. and Dora Abbell Librarian at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he has also served as Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics for many years. As librarian, Professor Kraemer oversees the most extensive collection of Judaica in the Western Hemisphere. Professor Kraemer has written several books, and more information about his books is available on the bio that we included with the sources. Dr. Kraemer has taught, I think, in just about every one of our series in our Monday webinar series. We're so pleased to have him teaching for us today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Kraemer.
There we are. Okay, unmuted. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. So hello, everybody. It is good to see you. Let me just change my view on my screen so it's more natural for me. Here we go. It's good to see those of you whom I can see. There are a great many of us, so I'm not going to go flipping from screen to screen, but it really is nice to see the screen populated this way. I have taught in virtually every one of these, maybe everyone, and it's really been a pleasure. So it's a pleasure to be back here in this series on storytelling, narrative, which is an immensely important topic. I know that this is the second of your sessions on this. I wasn't I didn't watch last session, so I don't know what kind of introduction there may have been, but I've got my own introduction. First, a very broad statement about stories, narratives, and their importance, and then about the specific work that I will be discussing with you. One of the first very impactful classes that I took when I was a graduate student at JTS was an absolutely wonderful class with a professor who had been away from JTS for a long time, but we still consider him to be a Ben Bayit, not only a friend of JTS, but really a member of our team in certain ways. His name is Shylock. I'm sure his is a name that some of you know. He's been teaching at Harvard for a good many years and is a very, very significant scholar. Shia then was much younger, as was I, as a graduate student, and he taught a class on narratives in rabbinic literature. And I was studying for my PhD in Talmud and rabbinics, and so this seemed like a natural course to take. And one of the things that I learned then, startlingly, I mean, I think it's fair to say that everybody in the class was impressed and startled by the extent to which what I'm about to describe was the case. What we did in the class was to view, session by session, parallel stories in the Babylonian Talmud and the so-called Jerusalem Talmud, or the Talmud of the land of Israel, and compare those stories, comparing and contrasting their similarities and differences. And what we found, and what's been useful to me as a scholar ever since, is that inevitably, when one compares the different versions of stories that are recounted in this case, different documents, the two different Talmuds, one finds that the versions of the story serve the interests and perspectives of that particular Talmud. What this means is that telling of stories is not a neutral enterprise. We don't simply tell stories that we've heard because we're entertained by the stories. We tell stories because they are important to us. They make a difference to us for one reason or another. And in ways that we both recognize and here, as importantly, don't recognize, we recount stories in ways that make sense of our world to us. Another way of saying that, and this is expressing it somewhat more cynically, but it's also true, is that we tell stories in a way that support our attitudes or positions or preconceptions. Humans need stories to support our sense of who we are and what community we belong to, and so forth. Anyhow, so that was my first lesson in this, and it's been something that I've been engaged in ever since. If you want to think about it in another way, think about, and this is really just offered as something to consider, think about the way the story of the last presidential election and the events following it have been told by different people of different political inclinations. There, it's easy to recognize how the recounting of stories, what's included, what's not included, serves the interests of the people who are telling the story. Again, human beings need stories because they make sense of our world for us, but the way we tell those stories justify who we are. So what about Operation Shylock? As you heard in the introduction, and many of you have taken classes with me before, you know that I'm a professor of Talmud and Rabbinics. So given what I just said, that one of my first exposures to the importance of stories and the different ways we tell them was in a course preparing me to understand the differences in the recounting of rabbinic stories. Why am I not doing that with you? Why am I going to a modern work, a work of the late 20th century by the well-known and sometimes controversial author Philip Roth, to share this perspective with you. So the answer to that is at least twofold. Maybe I'll come up with a third point here, but let me explain why I wanted to do this as the focus of our session. To begin with, Philip Roth has a special place in my heart because Philip Roth's mother and my grandmother were actually dear friends. They played mahjong together. They hung out together, spent time telling stories and other things. So when I grew up as a young person, I was always told about the connection of Philip Roth with my personal family. And I said, oh, that's cool. And this was, I mean, Roth's work is something that has compelled me ever since the time that I learned that Goodbye Columbus relates to events that actually were part of my own life. There's actually a scene in Goodbye Columbus, the wedding scene, that my grandfather and grandmother attended that wedding. And I was born during that very wedding. So I've known of the connection ever since the beginning. Beyond that, though, the second reason I wanted to share Operation Shylock with you, or at least selections from Operation Shylock, is that the most recent book that I've written, this is not yet published, I've delivered the book in its pre-edited version to the publisher, is a comprehensive study of attitudes toward diaspora on the part of Jews through history. We know a lot about views toward Zion, but I think it's fair to say that there's been less documentation of Jewish views toward diaspora over the course of our many centuries in diaspora. And coming back to this notion of justification, that the stories we tell justify who we are, I suspected and found through my research that this is indubitably the case, that Jews who have spent most of our history in our various diasporas had to have attitudes, had to tell stories or teachings that didn't represent diaspora life as pure misery, as something to be escaped in order to return to the promised land. As I say, that was my suspicion. Knowing what I know about stories and teachings and my research, which you will have the chance to read sometime next year, shows that this is in fact the case. There have been many, many Jewish teachings and stories about diaspora that are highly, highly favorable, quite unlike much of what we might have learned in the past. And so you'll excuse me for adjusting my kippah. In the midst of this, as I say, it was a comprehensive history. I went from certain books or stories of the Tanakh, including the Joseph story, including the Book of Esther, Book of Daniel, all the way up to the present day. And as I came to modernity, one of the texts that I needed to deal with was this book, Philip Roth's Operation Shylock, because one of the main characters in this book is a fellow who identifies himself as a diasporist. We should understand that if you had opportunity to read the selection that I chose, you will already be familiar with this concept, and we will be reading those texts together. But the Diasporist, who has the name Philip Roth, as we'll see in a moment, he offers a narrative that stands in opposition to the Zionist narrative. And it's a very, very challenging approach. And so I thought it would be worth our dealing with together. And that's what we're going to do. So let me explain how this book will fit into our way of thinking about stories and their importance. Then we'll jump into doing some reading. So as I say, stories justify who we are. They make sense of the world for us. What that means is that if there is confusion in our world, and we're willing to face that confusion, then the story we tell will have to be complicated, okay? If we feel conflict internally about some question in our lives, then the story we tell about the issue that is central to that conflict will have to be complicated. And this is an immensely complicated book. It is, in its way, if you go back to some of the reviews, both the original reviews and then later reviews, you'll find people using terms like hall of mirrors. There is mirroring back and forth, one statement and then its opposite, that one finds throughout the book. And that complicated representation of stories and their counter stories, I think, is very, very important for us. That is to say, Jews living in the contemporary world who care deeply about Israel, but at the same time live in diaspora. I can't see everybody on the screen, but I'm quite confident that as a program of JTS, most of us at least are living in diaspora as we gather together in order to discuss this. So these complications, what we're about to see in the book, I think it's fair to say, reflects some of the conflicts or complications that we feel, even if we're not aware that we feel them, and even if we would deny that we feel them. And one of the brilliant pieces of this book, and I do have to say that the original reviews of this book were very mixed, some highly favorable and some much less so. But as time has gone on, the reception of the book has grown more and more favorable for reasons that we can discuss. That's not central to our discussion, but if we're interested in that, we can certainly look at it. In any case, I think it's fair to say that I began to say one of the brilliant qualities of this book is the way it offers us arguments that we begin with thinking that we oppose, right? It offers arguments that will upset us. And Philip Roth, of course, was a controversial author. He provoked quite intentionally, and this book is very, very provocative. But part of what makes the provocation so interesting is how well Roth's characters reflect sympathetically upon opinions that we think we would disagree with. So what I'm going to ask you to do as we go forward is ask yourself, well, this is a view that I oppose, but can I find any sympathy in myself for what this particular character is expressing? And I think you'll find that the answer is yes. I certainly myself have found that that's the case. So that's broad introduction to why I chose the book. Let me give you one more word of setup introduction, which will lay out the complication of what we're about to see. And then I'll just stop for a moment to see whether there are any questions about the introduction. But let me fill in one more thing. The most important thing you need to know about this book as we evaluate it and the characters it represents is that there are 5 major characters that we're going to deal with. There are more than that in the book, but there are 5 major characters with 3 names. 2 of the characters are individuals whom Roth presumably invents for purposes of the discussion. One is a Palestinian who was a friend and hallmate of the main character at the University of Chicago by the name of George Ziad, or Z, and his opinion will be very important. We will have occasion to quickly reference an opinion, the opinion of a character whose name is Smileberger. He's a complicated character, and we don't need to worry about the details of who he is. beyond simply saying that he is involved in Israeli intelligence. So that's two of the characters, but then three of the characters are named Philip Roth. There are three Philip Roths in this book or related to this book, and we've got to try to keep in mind which Philip Roth we're talking about as we make sense of it. First of all, there's the actual author of the book, whose name is Philip Roth. That's the easy one. His opinion is the one we're going to explore indirectly. But then there are within the book two other Philip Roths. There is Philip Roth, the author, who is a character in the book, who is, it will surprise nobody who's ever read Roth, who's very, very close to the actual author who wrote this book. So there's Philip Roth, the author, and then there's Philip Roth, the author, who is also a character in the book. Those are two Philip Roths. There is then a doppelganger, whom we are introduced to with the name Philip Roth. There is a character who is going around in Poland and in Jerusalem who looks just like the author Philip Roth, who speaks just like the author Philip Roth, but is not actually Philip Roth. He is a Philip Roth double, and it is this Philip Roth who represents the position of the Diasporist. So those are three Philip Roths: the writer of the book, the character who's an author, and then the doppelganger, the double of Philip Roth, who we will conveniently, after our first meeting of him, reference as Pippic, because Philip Roth, the character in the book, actually, in order to make things easier, speaks of him as Pippic, or Popik, if you prefer. So Pippic is the nickname for the second Philip Roth, whom we will be considering within the book. If you're confused now, then that's probably a good thing, because it shows you how complicated all of this is, and you'll see the way the story weaves it all together and then lets it unravel. I'm going to pause now for a moment just to make sure I haven't confused you completely. Are there any questions about any part of my introduction?
Thank you. It almost makes you think that he didn't want people discussing this in classes. He made it intentionally confusing for this purpose. There's one general question, but I cannot resist sharing one thing. I'm very far from a Philip Roth expert, but I did want to note that JTS gave Philip Roth an honorary doctorate a few years ago, which was just a tremendous event. And you were probably at the luncheon as well afterwards. There was a donor luncheon afterwards with our honorees and their guests, and he hadn't. We invite the recipients of the honorary doctorates to speak at those luncheons, and he had declined to speak. And then, sort of in the moment, then he heard his fellow honorees speaking. He got up and said to us, I think this is the warmest reception that I've received from the Jewish community since my bar mitzvah. And it actually clearly meant a lot to him to receive.
Yeah, Julie, if I remember correctly, you were assigned to be his handler on that day. Am I remembering that correctly? Yeah, so when you were sitting outside the old library, just kind of waiting so that he wouldn't be in the crowd, I came out to introduce myself and tell him the story of the family connection, and he responded very, very warmly.
So it was exciting for JTS to have him, and I think in the end we felt good about how much it seemed to mean to him. So I just wanted to share that story. We just had just a general question, actually, really about what you were saying at the beginning when you were talking about the class that you took with your now colleague Shylock. And if a former member of the JTS community, was talking about Rabbi Neil Gilman and the way he talked about myths, and the person was wondering are you talking about stories the same way he talked about myths? Do you think that is there something? I guess he talked. Maybe you need to say for a minute.
That's a good question. I would say that myths, the way Neil Gilman spoke about them, are a certain kind of story. They have a canonical power, myths in the way that Gilman spoke about them. And they are absolutely crucial to the identity of any people. So in that respect, the answer is there is profound overlap. I think the difference is that Gilman focused particularly on kind of the grand story of a group or a nation or the like. And when I speak about it here, and when Shaya spoke about it, it even goes down to more intimate levels. I would even say the stories that we tell around the dinner table are in ways that we don't appreciate. This is the important thing. This is what I learned from Shaya. If you had asked one of the oral repeaters in ancient Palestine or in ancient Babylonia, this story that you're telling, are you changing it to serve your own interests or beliefs? They would have said, oh, no, 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 no. I'm telling the story in exactly the same way as I heard it. But that's not true, right? The storyteller thinks it's true, and they're not being dishonest when they deny it. But there's been immense scholarship on this. And what scholars who have examined this in oral cultures that still exists during the age of recording devices, right, going back to the early to mid 20th century, what they found is that if you ask a storyteller in an oral culture, are you telling this story the same way each time? The answer, they will say, yes, I'm telling it exactly the same way. And the objective answer is no, they're never telling it the same way. So storytellers introduce changes into stories that they're not aware of, and inevitably those changes will serve interests of the group that the storyteller is part of, or individual psychology, by the way, but that's another level of this discussion.
Great, thank you.
Anything else?
No, I'm just thinking about last week, Professor Cooper taught about Adam and Eve and a huge host of variant interpretations over time. So maybe that probably we can slot into the myth.
Oh, absolutely.
Category.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, this is going to be true whenever one takes a story seriously. And, a modern author is different than an ancient or a not so ancient oral storyteller. But, narratives always matter. Here I'm going to give a plug for my daughter's work. My daughter works in TV, but she's been engaged in TV and theater. I've grown to appreciate the central importance of what she does, because every culture tells its stories. It was done in theaters in ancient Greece, Rome. We all know at least the names of some of the authors of those plays. And it's true to this very day. And here I'm going to admit something that you may critique me for. I have had the experience of going to theater and finding myself moved and inspired in ways that I could never be through reading the texts of our tradition or, frankly, any other tradition. There's something about that oral, dramatic presentation. That's the importance of stories. And if we don't appreciate their importance, we actually cheat ourselves. Okay, so Julia, can I go on with the specifics?
Go for it. Okay,
so let's turn to the book itself. And Tani, why don't you share screen with the text? That's obviously not the page we need. Yeah, there we are. Okay. Let me go back to the first page there. Perfect. And I'm just going to make mine a little bit brighter so that I can see it. I hope you folks can see it okay. And we're going to look through several sections of this. Each is a little bit different, but they will be put together in a very interesting way. And I'm just so that you're not shocked by where my eye goes. You've got a copy that I made of my own volume of this book, much earlier, long ago, and I've since taken notes in my own copy of the book. So you'll see me looking down as opposed to the screen in order to look at my own copy, but I promise I'll look up at you afterward as well. So we are here, as you can see, page 31. The immediate background is this. Philip Roth, the author, the character in the book, has an assignment. He is going to be interviewing, or he's actually involved in a series of interviews with the distinguished Israeli author, Aaron Appelfeld. And he's about to go to Israel, where at the same time, there is both the trial of John Demjanjuk, so-called, who was accused of being Ivan the Terrible from Treblinka. And there is a very, very acute awareness of both recent Holocaust history and of anti-Semitism in general in this book. Various characters come back to it again and again and again. And it's also the period of the first intifada. So it's a very complicated time in Israel. Roth, the character, is at least not, allegedly not supposed to be involved with the current events. He's supposed to be interviewing Appelfeld, but it turns out to be far more complicated than that. So Roth is still abroad when we enter the story here on page 31. And Appelfeld has just called Roth and tells him that there is an article in an Israeli paper. This comes on the page before what you've got here. There's an article in an Israeli paper that reports on Philip Roth's visit to Poland to meet with Lech Wałęsa, whom you will recall as the spokesperson and mover behind the Solidarity movement, ultimately leading to Polish political independence. So he's been, with Wałęsa in Poland, and that's where we join him here on page 31. If you can, in the middle, you can see, and can we go further down on the page too, Tani? Does it move? Oh, it does. Okay, good. So we won't need the top of this so much, except to see, you could see near the top, all of this is from the newspaper report, which Appelfeld is translating for Philip Roth from the Hebrew. So allegedly everything we see here more or less is from the report. And you can see above that Roth, the character, is now being told that he has been with Wałęsa, and quote, the reason for my visit, says, as it turns out, the doppelganger to Wałęsa, was to discuss with him the resettlement of Jews in Poland once Solidarity comes to power there, as it will. And then a little bit down, you can see the headline had been Philip Roth meets Solidarity leader. Poland needs Jews, Wałęsa tells the author in Gdansk. Goes on now. And this, to begin with, is a report of what Wałęsa is saying, right? So this is the Polish political leader who's speaking. And we go to the last paragraph. You can see everyone speaks about Jews, Wałęsa told Roth. Spain was ruined by the expulsion of the Jews, the Solidarity leader said during their 2-hour meeting in the Gdansk shipyards. When people say to me, what Jew would be crazy enough to come here? I explained to them that the long experience over many hundreds of years of Jews and Poles together cannot be summed up with the word anti-Semitism. Let's talk about 1,000 years of glory rather than 4 years of war. The greatest explosion of Yiddish culture in history, every great intellectual movement of modern Jewish life, said the Solidarity leader to Roth, took place on Polish soil. Yiddish culture is no less Polish than Jewish. Poland without Jews is unthinkable. Poland needs Jews. Now, I'm going to provide an opportunity to stop and ask us to consider what do we think of Wałęsa's words here, but let's just get the whole report from the article out. Go, if you will, Tani, to the next page. So on the left, you can see Roth, the author of Portnoy's Complaint and other controversial Jewish novels, calls himself an ardent diasporist. He says that the ideology of diasporism has replaced his writing. The reason for my visit to Wałęsa was to discuss with him the resettlement of Jews in Poland once solidarity comes to power here. Right now, the author finds that his ideas on resettlement are received with more hostility in Israel than in Poland. He maintains that however virulent Polish anti-Semitism may once have been, quote, the Jew hatred that pervades Islam is far more entrenched and dangerous. Roth continues, the so-called normalization of the Jew is a tragic illusion from the start, but when this normalization is expected to flourish in the very heart of Islam, it is even worse than tragic. I'm skipping just a little bit. The time has come to return to the Europe that was for centuries and remains to this day the birthplace, he says, of rabbinic Judaism. The word rabbinic is wrong, but okay, Wałęsa gets that one wrong. Birthplace of rabbinic Judaism, Hasidic Judaism, Jewish secularism, socialism, and so on. The birthplace, of course, of Zionism too. But Zionism has outlived its historical function. The time has come to renew in the European diaspora our preeminent spiritual and cultural role. Now, skipping a few lines, you can see where it is underlined. Who and what is to prevail in Europe? The will of this subhuman murderer brute, meaning Hitler, or the civilization that gave mankind Shalom Aleichem, Heinrich Heine, and Albert Einstein? Are we to be driven for all time from the continent that nourished the flourishing Jewish worlds of Warsaw, Vilna, Riga, Prague, Berlin, Lvov, Budapest, Bucharest, Salonika, and Rome? Because of him, it is time to return to where we belong. And so it goes. That's the end of the article, as is mentioned on the top of the next page. Now, I want to step back for a moment. It is a very interesting little piece. Whether Wałęsa could have known these things is in some measure beside the point. I think what's important for our purposes is both the substance of the argument and the mouthpiece that the argument is given to. So, Wałęsa, of course, is a very sympathetic character. He was considered in his time and still as a hero, a genuine hero, forgetting about what's happened in Poland politically recently, certainly very heroic. And in his laying out of this argument, most of what he says, I would submit, is inarguably true. Now, what we do with that truth is something we might discuss, but if we respond to this as informed readers and ask, oh, well, is that right? Is that right? Is that right? The answer to almost everything he says is yes, that is certainly right. And even in the small detail that I took issue with, the birthplace of rabbinic Judaism, if by that he means a place where rabbinic Judaism flourished in ways that it rarely flourished anyplace else, then even there, Wałęsa is at least partially right. So this is our first diving in. We've got both our introduction to this strange Philip Roth, who is not Philip Roth, and to Wałęsa and their discussion. I'm going to stop now and ask for responses. What do you think? How does it work with you as a reader when you see this brief section? So whoever's taking the questions, please do, or the comments. Let's accumulate a couple of them, and then I'll respond to those, and we'll move on.
All right, right now I'm waiting for responses to come in.
Yeah, of course.
I'll just say while we're, and just to clarify, we're just doing questions and comments in the chat. So if you have something, please write it to me in the chat. Just a few people asked in the meantime what year the book was published, and I think it was 1993.
That's correct.
Right to you. Okay, can one be a diasporist and a Zionist at the same time? There's also a question about the name, about sort of the significance of Hippik, but I'm not sure that's on point right now. But we can.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that.
Is this view anachronistic in light of the rise of authoritarianism in Europe and the USA?
So that last question is a very important question. Of course, Roth in 1993 could not have known what would happen in Europe and in the United States, frankly, in more recent years. I would say that much of my information, I want to be careful about this, much of what I know about the experience in Poland, not just the Jewish experience, but certainly the Jewish experience and general political matters, it comes from my dearest friend, Rabbi Michael Shudrich, whom some of you may know by name. Rabbi Shudrich is the chief rabbi of Poland. He and I have been very dear friends for a long time, and we regularly spend time together discussing both the politics as, well, I mean, Jews in Poland and the politics of Poland as it pertains to the Jewish experience. Some of you may recall the plane crash that killed the prior president of Poland and led to the current president actually becoming president and affecting the entire political direction of the country. Michael Shudrich was supposed to be on that plane. He was invited, it was actually for a Holocaust World War II memorial, and he wasn't able to do it because the flight was on Shabbat. But if it hadn't been on Shabbat, he would have gone down with everybody else on the plane. According to his report, even today, there is far broader acceptance of Jews in Poland than we commonly hear. And perhaps as importantly, and this is really, really crucial, we may be seeing, as we speak, a revolution in the status and condition of Jews in Poland, because Poland, as you know, has taken in more refugees from Ukraine than any other country. If that hasn't, kind of demanded that we rethink what the country is about, it should, frankly. But amongst those, literally hundreds of thousands, I mean, there are different numbers, see perhaps more than 1 million refugees. I've even seen the number of 2 million who have at least come through. But amongst those are a good many Ukrainian Jews. And they are being housed by the Jewish communities in Warsaw and elsewhere, and they are being welcomed into those communities. It is quite likely that this war is leading to a very quick regrowth of Jewish presence population in Poland. Now, I know that's an indirect response to the question. Could Roth have known what would happen today? No, in multiple senses of the word. He couldn't have known the rightward move of many of the governments or some of the governments in Europe and elsewhere, but he also couldn't have known how the accidents of history would affect what it means to be a Jew in Poland for other reasons. And so what I would invite us to do is actually ask how these arguments remain pertinent even despite changes in historical circumstance. And this will lead us back to the prior question, is it possible to be a diasporist and a Zionist? I'm gonna actually just point that question out and not answer it, because we will come to an answer for it. It is precisely the complication of that question that the complication of this novel seeks to address. Anything else?
There are all a handful of interesting comments and questions. I thought maybe I can just read you a few, and if you want to pick one.
Yeah, go ahead, do it quickly, and then I'll go on to the next section.
Okay, so one person wrote, this is reading history backwards. Someone else, is it too painful to consider that from the cauldron of suffering, the profound can also emerge? Someone writes, despite the compelling nature of the arguments, my mind keeps going through all the pogroms throughout history. does Roth really mean Europe as a cradle of Jewish development, or is it a euphemism? Someone wrote, it reminds me of when I speak with Americans whose families come from Poland and they whitewash the Polish anti-Semitism from the pre-Hitler years. One woman said to me that the Jews and Poles shared culture and food. They didn't. It's amnesia or lack of knowledge. And one person wrote that that this book actually deeply changed their view of the diaspora, kind of in accordance with this idea that you've shared. So that's a smattering of what's come in the last few minutes.
Okay, so let me just say two things very quickly. Number one, as I said before, almost every detail, I think actually every detail that Vawenza gives voice to here is accurate. Slight adaptations, as I said, with respect to Rabbinic Judaism. Is it reasonable to speak of Europe as the cradle of Jewish civilization? I would say yes, just as it's reasonable to speak of the Muslim world as a cradle of Jewish civilization, in just the same way as it's reasonable to speak of the ancient Near East. But for most of us on this screen, if you're an Ashkenazi Jew, right, and that is, as you'll see, what they're addressing here. If you are an Ashkenazi Jew, that statement is indisputable. Judaism as Ashkenazi Jews know it is more a product of the European sojourn than it is of anything else. Now, what we do with that is another matter, but here I'm just talking about historical facts. With respect to the comment of anti-Semitism, here I would only say that we have to be careful in the early 21st century in evaluating our memories or the reports that have become part of our memories. The most anti-Semitic period in all of history, okay, and I say this without fear of contradiction, the most anti-Semitic period in all of history was the latter part of the 19th century through the mid-20th century, right? So those of you who were born before the founding of the State of Israel during the war, it's sobering to think about, but you lived during the most anti-Semitic period in all of history. And yes, there were during that period pogroms and other things. If one goes back to Polish Jewish history, which is the focus of this particular representation, going back to the 16th century, one will find a very, very different story. Was there anti-Semitism? Were there anti-Semitic events? The answer is, of course, there was some, and both in terms of anti-Semitism and the events, but nothing nearly approaching the late 19th century and beyond. And it is not unfair to describe Jewish life in Poland from the latter part of the 16th century until the 18th or 19th century as one of the greatest ages of Jewish history and productivity that there has ever been. And this is in towns that were, constituted of populations that were 30, 40, 50, more than 50% Jewish. And if you were a Christian Pole and you were living in those towns, and there were many of them, Jews were a constant presence, and your neighbors, and you engaged them in the marketplace. And this was not a life of separation and of hatred, although there was, of course, some of the latter. But let's be careful, because if we think about it all through the lens of the late 19th or 20th century, early 20th century, we will have a distorted view. And it's important for us to bear that in mind. Okay, let's go on to the next section. Let's share screen. And here, let's see, is that page 40 in front of us, or what pages do we have here? Let's go to page, the next set of pages should begin with page 40. Okay, 41 is fine. Good, that's where it begins. So what's happened here is that Philip Roth, the character, is very upset that he is being represented in a way that is not his own. This person representing themselves as Philip Roth, who is in Jerusalem at the time we're about to meet him here on page 41, has, this is not Philip Roth, the author, the character, and the author character is very upset. And so he wants to discover a little bit more about this person who is imitating him. And so he pretends to be a French journalist by the name of Pierre Roger. That is not an accident, meaning the fact that his initials are PR, as in Philip Roth. Pierre Roger is not an accident. He gets in touch with Philip Roth, the doppelganger, in Jerusalem at his hotel. And he begins to interview him. And so on page 41, you can see the beginning of this. And I mean, the self-awareness of Roth is fascinating here. So in the middle of the page, pretending to be this French journalist, he says, "You are a Jew," I said, "who in the past has been criticized by Jewish groups for your self-hatred, for your anti-Semitism, right? Would it be correct to assume?" Interruption. "Look," says the doppelganger, "I am a Jew, period. I would have not have gone to Poland to meet with Wałęsa if I were anything else. I would not be here visiting Israel and attending the Demjanjuk trial if I were anything else." He is a caring, deeply committed Jew. That's why he's doing what he's doing. But then he goes on. Well, actually, first, Philip Roth, the author, goes on and says, "But I persisted. Won't stupid people say that because of this resettlement idea, you are an enemy of Israel and its mission? Won't this confirm?" Again, interruption. He says, "I am Israel's enemy. If you wish to put it that sensationally, only because I am for the Jews and Israel. I am for the Jews, and Israel is no longer in the Jewish interest. Israel has become the gravest threat to Jewish survival since the end of World War II." Now he continues. Of course, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, Israel was the Jewish hospital in which Jews could begin to recover from the devastation of that horror, from a dehumanization so terrible that it would not have been at all surprising had the Jewish spirit, had the Jews themselves succumbed entirely to the legacy of rage, humiliation, and grief. Right? Our recovery actually came to pass in less than a century. Miraculous. Now here he's talking about Israel. Miraculous, more than miraculous. Yet the recovery of the Jews is by now a fact, and the time has come to return to our real life and our real home, to our ancestral Jewish Europe. Remember, this is Pippic, this is the doppelganger speaking. So Philip Roth, the author character, says, "Real home," right? Some real home. He goes on, Pippic says, "I'm not making promiscuous conversation," he snapped back at me. "The great mass of Jews have been in Europe since the Middle Ages. Virtually everything we identify culturally as Jewish has its origins in the life we led for centuries among European Christians. The Jews of Islam have their own very different destiny. I'm not proposing that Israeli Jews whose origins are in Islamic countries return to Europe, since for them this would constitute not a homecoming, but a radical uprooting." Right? So now he goes on, and I'm skipping just the next short piece. "No, for those Jews, Israel must continue to be their country, those from Muslim countries." And he has his solution. Once European Jews and their families have been resettled, population has been halved, the state can be reduced to its 48 borders, right? That is to say, not including the 67 additions. The army can be demobilized, and those Jews who have lived in an Islamic cultural matrix for centuries continue to do so. But now look at the next thing he says. "For these people to remain in a region," meaning European Jews, "as it should be, that the rightful habit, that's good. While for European Jews, Israel has been an exile and no more a sojourn, a temporary interlude." Very, very provocative use of terms: exile, sojourn. Right? Philip Roth challenges. Right? "Sir, what makes you think that Jews would have any more success in Europe in the future than they've had in the past?" He responds, "Do not confuse our long European history with the 12 years of Hitler's reign. If Hitler had not existed, if his 12 years of terror were erased from our past, then it would seem to you no more unthinkable that Jews should also be Europeans than they should also be Americans." Right? A discussion of Holocaust and so forth, middle of page 43. But Hitler did exist. right? He's speaking, he says he hears himself, Pierre Roget, saying this. And now Pippic, right, the doppelganger goes on, further down on page 43. The meanings of the Holocaust, he replied gravely, are for us to determine, but one thing is sure, its meaning will be no less tragic than it is now if there is a second Holocaust, and the offspring of European Jews who evacuated Europe for a seemingly safer haven should meet collective annihilation in the Middle East. Now, this is to begin with a pragmatic argument, but if we go to the next page, page 44 and 45, this goes on. Right, so near the top of page 44, in the immediate post-war era, when for obvious reasons Europe was uninhabitable by Jews, Zionism was the single greatest force contributing to the recovery of Jewish hope and morale. But having succeeded in restoring Jews to health, Zionism has tragically ruined its own health and must now accede to vigorous diaspora. So what's that? Diasporism seeks to promote the dispersion of the Jews in the West, particularly the resettlement of Israeli Jews of European background in the European countries where there were sizable Jewish populations before World War II, talks about rebuilding. It's a little bit below, further down in that same paragraph, diasporism's dream is more modest, meaning more modest than Zionism. A mere half century is all that separates us from what Hitler destroyed. If Jewish resources could realize that seemingly fantastic goals of Zionism in even less than 50 years, now that Zionism is counterproductive and itself the foremost Jewish problem, I have no doubt that the resources of the world Jewry can realize the goals of diasporism itself. Okay, now, pragmatic still, though with a bit of his weird and distorted idealism in what we've just heard. There's a response on the part of Philip Roth, the author, as Pierre Roget, again objecting. And he says something very interesting near the bottom of page 44 to 45. Whatever hatred for Jews may be present in Europe, and I don't minimize its persistence, there are ranged against this residual anti-Semitism powerful currents of enlightenment and morality that are sustained by the memory of the Holocaust. I skipped just a little bit. No such bulwark exists in Islam. Exterminating a Jewish nation would cause Islam to lose not a single night's sleep, except for a great night of celebration. I think you would agree that a Jew is safer today walking aimlessly around Berlin, where, of course, Roth already knows there is a sizable Israeli population, than going unarmed into the streets of Ramallah. This is all a very different kind of argument than what we saw earlier, but he lays out, again, a very, very interesting argument. Is it distorted? Do we know more on account of what's happened since? We could discuss that, but it's not a thoroughly unreasonable argument on its own terms. If we try to put aside our Zionist commitments and just ask, is there some sense to the argument here? We would recognize that rockets have fallen on places like Tel Aviv and have not fallen on Jewish communities in, say, Warsaw. So there's something sobering about this. I don't want to take a break here because there's actually more of the argument that we need to build before we can take what we just read and respond to it, I think, with full hearts. I'm skipping forward. And if you would go on to the next pages I provided you with, Tani, please. Okay, so we're on page 121. Good. Here we get a different voice, right? What we saw earlier was the laying out of Pippic's voice, both in the report from his meeting with Wałęsa and in the exchange with Philip Roth pretending to be Pierre Roget. On 121, we're introduced to the voice of a Palestinian, but this is a very different sort of Palestinian than the ones we might be accustomed to, filling in our minds. As I said in my introduction, this is a fellow, George Ziad, who he calls by a nickname Z, who did graduate studies at the University of Chicago, spent time with Philip Roth, the character author there. I have no idea whether Philip Roth, the actual author of the book, who did do graduate studies at University of Chicago, whether he had any equivalent friend, doesn't make any difference for present purposes. But Z represents the opinion of a Palestinian with a Western education and he's very articulate, as you'll hear, and a very sophisticated Western education, but he says some very provocative things. What's happened here is that Philip Roth, the author, is in Jerusalem. He has met Pippic. He's here shopping in the shuk, not the old city shuk, in Machane Yehuda, and all of a sudden he feels a tap on his back and he realizes, oh my God, this is Z. They haven't seen one another for years. He asks me, Philip Roth asks Z, how are you doing? What's going on? And so forth. And that is the part of the story that begins on page 121. In order to save time, go to the next page, Tani, 122, and on into 123. Right, he's got, okay, great, thank you. They've begun a conversation, Z and Philip Roth, the author, who is the character in the book. Philip Roth points out that, Z knows more about Israelis than a common, uneducated Palestinian might, and therefore should be expected to have a more nuanced view of Israel. But Z defends the position of those who are not as well educated as he has. So a few lines below the top of the page, Z says, to them, the Israeli Jew is so evil that they find it hard to believe, meaning they find it hard to believe that there are other kinds of Israelis. But now look at the way his argument goes on. What have they done? Right? Z is now speaking for himself. Name one single thing that Israeli society has done. Unsurprisingly, this is going to provoke us a lot, but listen carefully. Philip, my students are right. Who are they? What have they done? The people are coarse and noisy and push you in the street. I've lived in Chicago, in New York, in Boston. I've lived in Paris, in London, and nowhere have I seen such people in the street. The arrogance. What have they created like you Jews out in the world? Absolutely nothing. Nothing but a state founded on force and the will to dominate. If you want to talk about culture, there is absolutely no comparison. Dismal painting and sculpture, no musical composition, a very minor literature. I'm confident that Philip Roth, the real author, would dispute that, but okay. That is what all their arrogance has produced. Compare this to the American Jewish culture, and it is pitiable. It's laughable. I skip a little bit. These provincial nobodies look down on you, meaning on American Jews. Can you imagine it? There's more Jewish spirit and Jewish laughter and Jewish intelligence on the Upper West Side of Manhattan than in this entire country. And as for a Jewish conscience, as for a Jewish sense of justice, as for a Jewish heart, there's more Jewish heart at the Knish counter at Zabar's than in the whole of the Knesset. But look at you. And then he goes on with some personal stuff. I'm going to skip, if you will, go to 124, 125. Tani? Okay, great. Thank you. Toward the bottom of page 124 onto page 125. There's a line that begins with the word triumphant Israel, if you're following the page. Triumphant Israel is a terrible, terrible place to have coffee. These victorious Jews are terrible people. I don't mean just the Kahanas and the Sharons. I mean them all, the Oshuas, the Ozes included, the good ones who are against the occupation of the West Bank, but not against the occupation of my father's house, the beautiful Israelis, who want their Zionist thievery and their clean conscience too. What do they know about Jewish, these healthy, confident Jews who look down their noses at you diaspora neurotics? This is health, this is confidence, this is arrogance. Skipping to the top of the next page, 125. Jews without tolerance, Jews for whom it is always black and white, who have all these crazy splinter parties. These are Jews who are superior to the Jews in the diaspora, superior to people who know in their bones the meaning of give and take, following the Talmudic model, I might add, who live with success like tolerant human beings, right? Skipping a little bit. What they teach their children in the schools is to look down with disgust on the diaspora Jew, to see the English-speaking Jew and the Spanish-speaking Jew and the Russian-speaking Jew as a freak, as a worm, as a terrified neurotic, as if this Jew who now speaks Hebrew isn't just another kind of Jew, as if speaking Hebrew is the culmination of human achievement. And then he goes on, you get the argument. I want to just add one small piece here, a little bit further down on the page. And what these so-called neurotics here, Z talking about diaspora Jewry, have given to the world in the way of brain power and art and science and all the skills and ideals of civilization. To this, they are oblivious. But then to the entire world, they're oblivious. Oh, what an impoverished Jew this arrogant Israeli is. Yes, they are the authentic ones, the Yeshuas and the Ozes. And tell me, I asked them, what are, and he has his particular list of intellectual heavyweights here that he goes through, including some names you'll know, some you won't, Leonard Bernstein, Bella Abzug, Allen Ginsberg. This is their great Jewish achievement, to make Jews into jailers and jet bomber pilots. Now, this is a very, very dichotomous argument. It is obviously one that is powerfully rejecting of Israel as the occupying power from the perspective of the Palestinians. But he's also focusing on something here in the story that I would submit we have to identify with, which is the attitude that Zionism taught from its earliest stages, at least the form of Zionism that came to triumph in the state, which was one in which negation of the diaspora was central. And negation of the diaspora came with an attitude that looked down upon the human qualities that had come to characterize diaspora Jews and the achievements of diaspora Jews. In all of that, Z is not incorrect. He's captured something here very powerful. What I would say is that as we think about this, and what I really want to do now is spend a few minutes, open up to your thoughts and responses. But I think it's important for us to actually find our sympathy for this because, and now comes back to the original question, how we tell stories. Do we not, as diaspora Jews, have misgivings about the way diaspora experience has often, not just sometimes, but often been thought about by Israelis and Israeli culture? Do we not have our feelings of resistance, pushback? And here I'll speak personally. I teach at the Jewish Theological Seminary. The Jewish Theological Seminary is a powerful Jewish cultural institution, which has had some of the world's greatest scholars in the last several generations, who have contributed easily as much from their diaspora positions to Jewish culture and scholarship as has been contributed on the Israeli side. So how do we feel about the dismissal of this contribution of what is most important about being a Jew? If we don't have misgivings about it, then I don't think we're being thoroughly honest with ourselves. And that's part of what is captured, I would submit, in this part of the story, even if it comes from a voice that for many of us is the voice of the enemy. And I put that in scare quotes because I think enemy is a complicated characterization for someone like Z. But I've said enough in my reading right now. Let's just open up and see what people are thinking before we go on to the final selection.
Great. So this was from a little while ago, but someone wrote, so Pippic seems to the reader as one of the two minds that a lot of people have come to be in about Israel, especially recently, and that's why Roth is so prescient. And again, there was the question about the name Pippic. So I wonder if you want to address either or both of those.
Yeah, so the first observation I think is absolutely correct. I think one of the reasons that the critical reception of this book has grown more favorable is because it is immensely prescient. I mean, just startlingly so in terms of the way events would follow events and attitudes would develop. Here, I actually want to introduce, I was thinking about it as I was reading it, and I don't want to leave it out. Don't imagine for a moment that the stereotype of the Israeli that Z expressed, the arrogance, all of that business, don't imagine that that's just the view of the opponent. First of all, if you yourself haven't had that voice in your head, or if you haven't heard that voice on the part of other American Jews, then you're in the minority, because the truth is that not only do American and other diaspora Jews recognize this as part of the Israeli personality, Israelis, of course, recognize this. And they will speak about it, though with a different affect than we might. The other thing that needs to be said is that there's some prominent thinkers, Zionists through and through, who live or lived in Israel, who have expressed concern for this same sensibility. My niece who lives in Israel, her former father-in-law, who was a Rosh Yeshiva with the yeshiva on the West Bank, he died tragically young, just a few months after her wedding to her husband. He's written about the need of Israelis to be informed by the Jewish diaspora experience. His name, you don't need to know his name actually. He goes by he's known by the name Shagar, S-H-A-G-A-R. And in the one volume of English translations of his essays, there's a wonderful essay on Sukkot, on the holiday of Sukkot, where he speaks about the fact that the Sukkah represents Jews wandering. It therefore represents diaspora. And what it says is that if Jews don't live in diaspora, they will never be able to live justly on their own land. And in his writing, he speaks about the arrogance and the cruelty of the settlers that he sees living just down the street from him. Right? So this is not something that comes just from an opponent. This is a characterization which we find reported amongst the most Zionist of Zionists. I just want to say that so we are not so quick to dismiss everything that Z says. Now, coming back to Pippic, yes, Philip Roth, the character, the author, in the book assigns Pippic the name as a dismissal. He belittles him. Unknown to himself at the time, this belittling relates to someone who's experienced some very serious difficulties in his life. If I had named Pippic, I would have felt guilty about it after learning more about his personal experience. And I think we're meant to feel that. But it becomes a convenient way to speak about the other voice. What I think happens here, and this is very important for our consideration of these conflicting stories. And let me go on just to fill in. There's, as I said, a lot that is sensitive to the history of anti-Semitism in this book. There is a great deal that is stated that is sympathetic to the Zionist Israeli experience, including what we've already seen, how Israel represented a miracle of recovery following the Holocaust. There's also discussion, Pippic has founded a support group modeled on Alcoholics Anonymous called Anti-Semites Anonymous. and Pippik's girlfriend, who is a prominent figure in the book, a Polish woman, who was in the past an anti-Semite, and Philip Roth knows of Polish anti-Semitism, of course, but she's gone through this rigorous, retraining in order to identify her own anti-Semitism and leave it behind. Every time there is an argument in the book, there is a counter-argument. Every time there is a view expressed, there is the counter view. And the question I have to ask, and I know we've got comments here, but I'm now going to be adding to the complication, is if we've got a view expressed by someone like Pippik or someone like Z, does Philip Roth, the writer of this book, when he chooses those characters, does he mean for us to dismiss the arguments because they're assigned to people who are either enemies or unusual? That's one possible reading. Another possible reading is that both Pippik and Z are individuals that we can respond to with sympathy, and I believe they are. And beyond that, the fact is that what they express is more attractive than we might like to admit at first blush. And we've got to consider that as well. If we've got a bad spokesperson for a good argument, what does that do for the argument? That's part of the complication of this book as well. Okay, so what other comments do we have? How are they piling up, and what do I have to respond to?
There are many.
Good.
Yeah, really many. Okay. Sorry,
You're in a difficult position.
Yeah, I really am. And people, this is also, has become one of those sessions where people are sharing, kind of their personal connections to these issues.
Great. You know what? It's great that it's great that it makes connections on the personal level. I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah, I guess a few people have. Here's a comment that maybe represents a handful that have come in. So someone wrote, "It's a strange view of European history to see the Holocaust as, quote, just 12 years of a madman, as if it was not in some ways the culmination of anti-Semitic forces present within European society."
Stop right there.
For generations.
Okay, stop right there, because I want to observe that is a narrative, right? We could argue about whether what you just read is true or not. After the war, under the influence of the birth of the State of Israel and the triumph of Zionism, that version of European history came to be the dominant one. I could argue the facts of it, and someone could argue back against me. I could tell a very different story that accounted for anti-Semitism, but didn't make it dominant, and crucially, didn't see the Holocaust as the natural outcome of the European experience. Some listeners may agree with what you just read, others may disagree. For my purposes, all that matters is that we recognize that that's one version of the story that justifies certain allegiances and outcomes. That is not an objective representation of Jewish history in Europe. Go ahead.
Okay, I think I was just, as you were speaking, looking at the comments expressing that kind of view. I don't think people are thinking of it as the inevitable outcome, but that it was well rooted, that the anti-Semitism was well rooted in a multi-generational way, and it came to that, not that it inevitably came to.
But I would ask everybody to consider anti-Semitism. If we use the term correctly, in the strictest sense, anti-Semitism is a modern phenomenon. Anti-Semitism is a form of racialism. It was born during the age when science, and we would now put this science in scare quotes, began to look to racial characteristics as determining the qualities of different peoples. And so, if we want to be strict with ourselves about it, we have to use anti-Semitism only pertaining to the modern phenomenon. There was, of course, a great deal of European, as well as Islamic, anti-Judaism, right, which is a different phenomenon. And the question would become, here you were talking about roots, but even to describe it as roots is a way of telling the story, because you've offered an analogy there, which may or may not be useful. Is it fair to see anti-Semitism, a racialist phenomenon, as rooted in anti-Judaism, which is a religious phenomenon? We could argue that on both sides. You'll notice I'm very, very carefully not taking a position here. I just want to notice the way our telling of stories affects what we take to be true. Go ahead.
That's very helpful, and I couldn't find it, but someone earlier on commented on, we have to be careful to distinguish between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. So thank you for doing that. Well, I'm just mindful of how we want to do the next 9 minutes. Because I have.
Yes, there's one more thing I want to add. There's one more thing I want to share, and I don't think you have this, and even if you have it, don't put it on screen. Let me just read it, because I don't think I included this in the piece, but it turns out to be, as it were, the final grand statement in a way. So I mentioned in my introduction this character Smilesberger. Smilesberger works for Israeli intelligence, although earlier in the novel he pretended to be something else. This all relates to the intelligence operation, which has been labeled Operation Shylock, from which the book gets its name. I'm reading from page 334 here, but it goes earlier. Smilesberger is a very knowledgeable Jew who is a fan of the Chofetz Chaim. Chofetz Chaim was the writer and known best for his treatise on Lashon Hara, on speaking evil one person regarding another, and particularly Jews vis-a-vis Jews. And so here Smilesberger is in the midst of a long excursus on Jews speaking against Jews. Think about what we might have been doing about how politics affects Jews speaking against Jews. So here Roth is more brilliant than anywhere else he knows what this is about. And so Smilesberger says as follows, and listen carefully, please. Why couldn't Jews be one people? Why must Jews be in conflict with one another? Why must they be in conflict with themselves? Because the divisiveness is not between Jew and Jew, it is within the individual Jew, right? What we're not sufficiently aware of is the way we argue with ourselves. And that's what this book is, I think, ultimately all about. Is there a more manifold personality in all the world? I don't say divided. Divided is nothing. Even the Goyim are divided. But inside every Jew, there is a mob of Jews. The good Jew, the bad Jew, the new Jew, the old Jew, the lover of Jews, the hater of Jews, the friend of the Goy, the enemy of the Goy, the arrogant Jew, the wounded Jew, the pious Jew, the rascal Jew, the coarse Jew, the gentle Jew, the defiant Jew, the appeasing Jew, the Jewish Jew, the de-Jewed Jew. Shall I go on? Do I have to expound upon the Jew as a 3,000-year amassment of mirrored fragments to one who has made his fortune as a leading Jewologist in international literature? Here he's speaking to the author, Philip Roth, Smilesberger is. I think this just gets right to the point, and I can't help but read this as the purpose of the novel altogether. The many internally contradictory voices. This is a Jewish story. In some ways, it's a Jewish story par excellence. I mean, better than any other Jewish story, better than any other Jewish narrative I know, precisely because it offers not one view, but conflicting views, right? The part within us that represents this kind, the part within us that represents the opposing kind. That's what Jewish history has led us to. We've had many, many personalities in our many, many places through our history. And the fullest way of being Jewish is to embody all of them, to let that mob be within us. And I think that's what Roth is trying to argue for here, that we've got that mob within us if we're willing to be open to it. And that is the complication of living as a Jew in this most complex of times. If we erase the contrary voices, we're doing a disservice to ourselves as individual Jews and to the Jewish world more generally. I don't know if I'm right in that, but that is my interpretation. And I invite any either older response or, we've got 5 minutes left. Julia, please.
One question on my list was why do you think Roth wanted to take on this issue in this way? Why did you want to take on the issue, period? And why do you think he chose to do it this way? I think it connects a little bit to what you were just saying, but maybe to address that more explicitly.
I think it goes back to two things. Number one, what you said before about Roth's joy when he got the honorary degree. And secondly, in experience I'll just describe, it is impossible to exaggerate the Jewish concern of Philip Roth and the extent to which he was a Jewish author. And I mean that, impossible to exaggerate. I was a teenager, young teen, I don't remember what year it was, but I was a teenager when Portnoy's complaint was published. And I didn't read it. I didn't even sneak to read it. Everybody knew its reputation. I was too embarrassed to read it. And I didn't wind up reading it until about 7 or 8 years ago. And I was absolutely stunned at how virtually its entire concern was what it meant to be a Jew born in and growing up in Newark, New Jersey, moving to the suburbs, all of the complexity of that. That is my family's story, right? My father went to Weequahic High School. I was born in Newark. My family moved to the nearby suburbs. And it's all about what it means to be a modern suburban Jew with all the complexity of that. So why did he write about this? Because he didn't care about anything else more than he does or did. I mean, more than he did about this topic and its relation to other Jewish topics.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to give you two totally different questions and you choose which you want to address in the last couple minutes. So one is about, you alluded earlier to the changing reception of this book and sort of, right, because it's a 30-year-old, almost a 30-year-old book. So I don't know if that's something you want to address, sort of where would these arguments be today? And the second is a topic close to your heart as you were telling us about your new book. Someone asked, isn't Judaism itself a diaspora religion developed at the end of the Israelite temple cult period, influenced by Hellenism and Babylonian culture?
So the answer to the second is unambiguously yes, right? It is, of course. What was the first one again about?
It's about the changing reception of this of the book.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, if you want to find I mean, just Google it. I mean, it's easy to find various reviews and discussion of the fact that the reception of the book has changed. So I don't need to give you specific references. They're easy to find. All I will say is, coming back to an earlier question, while Philip Roth could not have, anticipated what would be happening in Europe in the 2000 and whatever, what year are we in now? Since 2016 or the mid, 2000 teens. I believe actually that for the moment, this book is a classic, by which I mean whatever changes, important parts of its foundation will remain eternally important as expressions that we need to consider and engage. I really do believe that.
Thank you so much. So near the beginning, you talked about how the book is intentionally provocative and begins with arguments that we instinctively want to oppose, but that his characters present the arguments in ways that we're inclined to sympathize with. So I just want to, I'm just repeating that because there's just tremendous response to the session in the chat. It's sort of exploding. And this inner conflict that's addressed, the inner conflict of the Jew, which is addressed explicitly and implicitly and sort of structurally in the book, seems to really be resonating with people very much. And I think just to step back to to the larger theme of stories, right? Any inner conflicts that we have, in a way, it's sort of competing stories that we're telling ourselves, and that's what he's encapsulated in this book. So I think this is a tremendous contribution to this series, and thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So thank you for teaching. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Thank you once again to our sponsors from this whole past year. And we're off next week for July 4th. And then we'll be back in 2 weeks with Rabbi Michal Springer for, I imagine, a quite different session. So we look forward to seeing everyone then. And thank you again, Professor Kraemer, for teaching us today.
Bye-bye.